Greetings, Com 600. This is Ben Frazier. I just wanted to take a moment and introduce myself and tell you how much I appreciate you being in this class. I've been teaching this class many years and really feel like I've formed it into something that not only am I familiar with, but the content area in this class I'm very excited about. I have read multiple times these authors. I know many of them personally, and I really think the usefulness of this class is important for the master's program and the PhD program here in the College of Communication and Arts at Regent University. Let's talk briefly about the title. I just want to, as a way of introduction, story, popular culture, and worldview. Now that's a lot. We're starting with story. Why that term? And the reason is because we, I believe, as human beings, made in God's image, are homo narrative. We're human storytellers. And that's what that term really comes from the scholar at USC, Dr. Walter Fisher. And he argues in his book and in many of his articles that whatever else we are as human beings, we tend to organize our communication around stories. That doesn't mean that every bit of communication is story. When you say pass the butter, well, that may not be a story. But certainly given time, when you buy a car, you ask the person that you're buying the car from, tell me about this car. He tells you a story. Even writing papers in a class, in a sense, under certain circumstances and structure, is a story. A preacher preaching a sermon is a story. You walk into a restaurant or a bar and somebody talks to you and tells you about a story. So we are a storied people. The stories of any culture represent the beliefs and the values and in many ways shape the culture of that society or that community. For many years I've been going to Tanzania, and I have collected over 80 to 100 stories that the Maasai tell their children after a day's hard work. They'll sit around and they'll tell stories, animal trickster stories, some of them, some myths, some warrior stories, some monster stories, all different kinds of stories that are embedded within those stories are the beliefs and values that shape that culture. And one of the things I'm very concerned about and want to communicate to you through our reading is that the Bible is a group and a collection in many ways of stories. Jesus did not hardly speak without speaking in parables. You listen to the Old Testament, and yeah, there's history and poetry and song, but there's a lot of just stories, good, important stories that shape and come out of the culture, in many ways an oral culture in the early Old Testament time. So stories become important to every culture, Maasai culture, Hebrew culture, and American culture. And so one of the changes we want to look at is who are the storytellers today? And how are they telling the stories? And how is that shaping us? Someone once said, I don't know who discovered water, but I don't believe it was the fish. And I think that's kind of an apt a saying, because sometimes we fail to examine our own culture and figure out where our culture values and beliefs and understanding, sensibility comes from. And my sense is that we need to be more careful in not only our storytelling, but even our lives. When we give account of our lives, we play a part. We decide what role we want to play. Are we the hero? What kind of hero? Are we more of a minor role, a major role in the stories we tell? So stories become very, very important to every culture. And of course, in our culture now, the media is shaping us. Games, video games, television, film, literature, newspaper, all those are ways of telling and explaining our lives and our story. They are views. They are windows to our understanding of how life works and what role do we play as human beings and what role God plays. So stories are the fundamental element that we'll be looking at in this culture, and a story with a larger view of what really a story is. And we'll break it down into, I know there's beginning, middle, and end, and there's characters, and we have to look at the characters and the stories, and there's a plot, and all those kinds of things. But we need to understand the importance of story for every culture. And that gets us to the second part, popular culture. And when we say culture today, there is such a thing as, and most of our culture is shaped by the technology, is shaped by the globalization, shaped by the influences of both technology and human beings on our storied existence. And so our culture, in many times, there are stories that hold it together, that give it sense and meaning. And those stories then turn into a kind of a difficult term, and I think this week, as you've been looking at and trying to maybe define and figure out what worldview is, it's not a clear term. It is admittedly a sloppy term, but in some ways it's the best term we have to explain how people view and come to understand and know our world and how we function in it. So we start with story, we move to culture, and we look at how culture is shaped and how communities are shaped and in that cultures. And then we move on to what kind of projection that is in terms of worldview. And we see that in most of the stories that our culture is producing and others around the world, you can see a worldview, a way of looking at the world and understanding it. And I'm not defining it purposefully right now. I want you to wrestle with that a little bit. I believe in that Socratic approach, and then eventually I'll come in and say, okay, here's some ideas about story and about culture and about worldview, definitions that we need to have. Those are very important. So that's why we're looking at our story. We're trying to understand communication's role, which communication plays a very important part in shaping and influencing our culture. And communication, as you probably well imagine, has changed profoundly. Interpersonal communication is changed a lot by the dynamics of spending so much time in the presence of and with mediated communication. So much of our lives are given to online videos and online texting and all those different ways of us understanding and dealing with our culture. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to be examining and looking at. I think I have several texts. We're starting out with the question of God, looking at Lewis and Freud representing the modernist kind of approach to understanding our world, a scientific approach where privileges reason. Lewis privileges revelation and God's working in our world, gives place for that, which really doesn't find much room in Freud's world. Freud being raised in a Jewish home, Lewis raised in a Christian home, but both men fell away from God. Lewis, as you know, came back, and Freud really didn't come back to his Hebrew roots or to a Christian roots. He stayed in his scientific and secular roots to the end of his life as best we can understand. So you look at those two men and see the kinds of things that shape their lives, their family certainly, their cultures in many ways, science and technology, of course, but along with all those are the stories that help shape their lives. And then we're going to go through the other books. I won't take time now to go through each one of them, but all of them look at communication process, sometimes through story, sometimes through creating culture, and they all add a part to how we can do two things. One, examine and interrogate our culture and the stories in our culture to see how they're infecting us and how they're influencing our world. And the second is to encourage you to be more determined and more intentional in your storytelling, realizing that your stories not only affect your children and your families, but they affect our world in profound ways. And so we need to be the best storytellers possible. And because we're in the area of communication, we're going to be looking at people who are going to tell and communicate stories, and that's part of what you want to do. and going to do in your occupations from here on out, whether you're teaching or whether you're working in ministry of some kind or working in business of some kind. You will help shape the stories of our world. And so we really want you to make good stories and become great storytellers. And so those are the kinds of things we're looking at. So welcome aboard. This is going to be a fun ride. You have about every 2 weeks you have a book you have to read. So there's a lot of reading. I think 3 major papers and then 3 major book reviews and then 1 major paper and then kind of a final exam at the very end. So looking forward to seeing you. I'll try to do this once a week. I'll try to do it a little earlier in the week. Won't always be able to do that, but I will as much as possible. God bless you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. And of course, you know, I have some great people helping me. Dr. Jim Ward, who's going to be over the journalism students, and then 2 TAs who are taking the different groups, Group A and B. Make sure you find your group that you're in and begin to respond to that one question there. There's a lot of grace this first week, so don't worry too much about, get the book and begin to read The Question of God by Nikolai, but don't worry too much about how well you write your first week. But after that, we're really going to want you to be making scholarly contributions, which means you need references, and you can't just give opinion. You got to give good reasoned response, especially to that initial thread. So those are the kinds of things I wanted to introduce you to, and I want to say hi, welcome aboard. We're looking forward to seeing you, and I'll see you again next week, and I'll see you, some of you, online as I look particularly at the doctoral students, but I check the rest of them as well. God bless. Bye-bye.